The following is an interview with Professor Nancy Pearcey for her book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. I provide a review of her book in the notes for this episode on my website at mereliberty.com/041.
In this episode of Dare to Think, Kerry talks with Professor Nancy Pearcey about the phenomenon known as toxic masculinity, its genuine origin, as well as implications for the Christian church today. Nancy Pearcey is the author of The Toxic War on Masculinity, How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes, as well as Love Thy Body, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and Total Truth. She is professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. She has been quoted in The New Yorker and Newsweek, highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, and hailed in The Economist as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual.
Join me, Kerry Baldwin, with Professor Nancy Pearcey as we dare to think about the toxic war on masculinity. So today I'm speaking with Professor Nancy Pearcey, author of the book, The Toxic War on Masculinity. Thanks for joining me on Dare to Think, Nancy.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm so excited to talk to you and to talk to you specifically about this book. And I want to give you a chance to just introduce it a little bit and answer the question for me. What's the main problem the book is trying to solve?
Yeah, so it is considered a work of apologetics, and I find that I have to start explaining that at the beginning because so many readers just want to jump straight into sort of in-house debates over egalitarian complementarianism, and I actually don't deal with that. I am interested in how we address the secular world, and so I'm looking at where did the concept of toxic masculinity come from, how did it develop, and how do we respond to it more effectively? And so I do a lot of history, like on concepts of masculinity, from the colonial era to our own day. How did our society become more secular, and how did that affect views of masculinity? And how do we deal with it today, of course, because men are falling behind. Men and boys are falling behind at all levels. Boys are falling behind in education, starting in kindergarten. They can't manipulate a scissors as well because they don't have as good fine motor control. So they feel like they're falling behind even in kindergarten. And they are behind in terms of both grades and test scores all the way through high school. In college, there are now 60% female students and only 40% males. So men are falling behind at that level too. And even graduate school and professional school, there are now more females than males. And then after they're done with school, men are falling behind both relative to women and relative to where they used to be in terms of homelessness, drug addiction, even crime. 90% of prison inmates are male. Unemployment. This was a bit of a surprise because it's not showing up since it doesn't appear in the unemployment statistics because they've given up looking for work. And so researchers had to dig a little deeper. And they tell us that male unemployment is now at Great Depression era levels.
Oh my gosh.
And that was a shock because we all remember what a crisis that was.
Yes.
Great Depression era levels. And then even life expectancy. Men are falling behind in terms of their life expectancy has gone down. And again, women's has not. So it's not a general trend. There's a magazine called The New Scientist. And it had an article on this, and it said, the major demographic factor now in early death is being male.
Wow.
So I wanted to address, on the one hand, how can we have a redemptive effort to help men and boys? It's time to have compassion on men and boys and see if maybe there's some programs that would help them succeed. The thing is, girls are doing great, and that's wonderful, but it's because they did have programs, 1972 Title IX, 1994 Gender Equity Act, poured millions of dollars into curriculum, into equity workshops, into training materials. And the idea was we would bring girls up to the level of boys. Nobody anticipated that the girls would just shoot right past boys, and are now doing so much better. but maybe it's time to have some programs now that are geared specifically for boys.
So this is a good introduction, I think, because I have noticed, I follow you on social media, and I have noticed that your book has been a bit of a controversy, and I think it's been a bit of a controversy in the framework of that complementarian, egalitarian sort of debate. Do you suppose that the pushback that you've received on the book is because people reading it are just sort of stuck in this framework that if you're defending men, you must be taking a patriarchal stance? Or if you're, do you find that, or why do you suppose there is some controversy around it?
Well, I'll start with, before the book even came out, it has proven to be the most controversial book I've written. And that was a surprise because my earlier book, Love Thy Body, covered issues like abortion and homosexuality and transgenderism, which are still cutting edge issues. But when I write a book, I often lead a lot of classes on the manuscript. I lead a lot of reading groups to catch all the rough edges. And when they would tell their family and friends that they were working through a manuscript on masculinity, immediately the first question was, whose side is she on? Like you either, well, most men assumed that a woman writing a book on masculinity would be a male bashing feminist.
Right. Yeah.
And more progressive types did think, like you just said, that I'm some sort of neo-patriarchalist, angry, reactionary culture warrior.
Right.
And so the same controversy has dogged the book since it came out. And like you said, specifically within the Christian world, it's been egalitarian versus complementarian. And neither side is very happy with the book because I say right from the beginning, that's not my goal.
Mm-hmm.
And I give the reason too. But the reason is that two of the top marriage researchers in the country say that a husband's gender theory, that's how they put it, doesn't seem to make much difference in how happy his wife is. In other words, they focus on the wives especially, right? Because the idea is that if you have any notion of a male headship in the home, it will turn men into these overbearing, oppressive patriarchs. And so one of the researchers that I rely on quite a bit is considered perhaps the top marriage sociologist in the country, Brad Wilcox, who teaches at the University of Virginia. And he said, based on his research, the husband's gender theory just doesn't seem to play a role in whether his wife is happy or not. So he looked at both complementarian marriages and egalitarian marriages. And he said, well, in our research, the egalitarian marriages were not any happier. You might expect they would be, but I mean, the facts are that they're not. And the other top marriage researcher is a psychologist. His name is John Gottman. And he said, the people coming into my practice, some of them believe the man should be in charge of the marriage, and some of them are more egalitarian. And he said, we're not finding a difference. And here's how he put it. Emotionally intelligent husbands have figured out the most important thing, which is how to convey honor and respect to your wife. And so I put that at the front of the book. I told my readers I'm not dealing with this because it doesn't seem to make a difference. And besides, it's not really my interest. My interest is engaging the secular world.
Right.
But nonetheless, you are absolutely right. Everybody wants to shove it into that sort of in-house debate, whether they're from the egalitarian side or if they're from the more, neo-patriarchal side. They all want to be able to say, but what's your position on this? So you're right. That's exactly what the book is. That's the kind of controversy it's stirred up.
Yeah, well, I think probably one of the reasons why I enjoyed the book so much is because I'm in the neither complementarian nor egalitarian camp. I myself want to move past that whole debate. Let's jump into some of the content of your book. One of the first things that you point out straight away is this difference between the good man and the real man script. Can you explain that?
Yes, I put that right at the front precisely because, like I said, in the manuscript form, I was already stirring up controversy. And so I thought, okay, when they say whose side is she on, I want to help them to see you don't have to take sides.
Right.
And a lot of people found this study very helpful for that. So it's by a sociologist, not a Christian. His name is Michael Kimmel. and he's well known in his field, so he gets invited to speak all around the world. And he came up with an ingenious experiment where he asked young men 2 questions. He would ask them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and then in the eulogy, somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the young men had no problem answering that. They would immediately start listing off duty, honor, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy. I like that one.
Yeah.
Be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And the sociologists would say, where'd you learn that? And they say, I don't know. It's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would often say it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. And then he would follow up with the second question, and he would say, okay, what does it mean if I say man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, no, that's completely different. That means, be tough, be competitive, never show weakness, suck it up, play through pain, get rich, get laid, using their language. Mm-hmm. And so the sociologists concluded that men are sort of trapped between these 2 opposite scripts. On the one hand, they do intrinsically, inherently know what it means to be a good man. It is global. It's not just in countries with a Christian background. We would say they're made in God's image, right? And so they do have an innate sense of why God created them. What's the biblical blueprint? It's built in. So as we would say, all men are made in God's image. And so they do have that innate, inherent, intrinsic sense of what it means to be a good man. They have the sense of God's blueprint for masculinity. Or Romans 2, right? We all have a conscience. But at the same time, men are being pressured by a cultural expectation that says to them, to be a real man, you need to fulfill these other traits, which are quite different. And they're not all bad. I mean, we need people who will be tough in a crisis. But if it gets disconnected or decoupled from the good man, then it can slide into things like entitlement and dominance and misogyny and the other things that we associate today with a more toxic version of masculinity. The Andrew Tate phenomenon, right? Fast cars, fast money, fast women.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately is actually becoming more and more common these days. In fact, let me give you a story. This just happened. Mm-hmm. One of my former graduate students now teaches at a high school. And she wrote me an email saying, all my students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotes in the yearbook.
Oh, gosh.
So I asked, where do you teach? Mm-hmm. She's at a classical Christian school.
Wow. So
even Christian young men are being drawn into a much more secular image of masculinity. This is why it's so important for us to deal with the subject. If we're not teaching a biblical, healthy view of masculinity, young men today are being subject to these online influencers like Andrew Tate, who I watched him do an interview where he said, quite openly, I'm a pimp. Yeah. And what I do is pornography.
Right.
And Myron Gaines has been, I don't know if you know his name, but he's being heralded in the New York Post as the new Andrew Tate.
Oh, wow.
And his tagline is, I help men transform from simps into pimps.
Wow.
And he's written a book where he said all the relationships between the sexes has been transactional. All men are Johns, all women are whores.
Oh, wow.
And he has a program called Fresh and Fit that's becoming immensely popular. So this is why I wrote the book. Yeah. We really need to teach our young men to have a critical grid,
right,
so that they can recognize the secular nature of this toxic script for masculinity,
right,
and really recover a much more biblical view.
Right. One of the themes that I notice in your book is the fact that the biblical idea of manhood is so starkly different from the secular idea of manhood. But you explain how Christian men are absorbing the secular script, as you call it. You mentioned this classical school and how all of the boys are drawn to Andrew Tate. I come from from homeschooling circles where classical education is very, very popular. That was all, the homeschooling movement was all an effort to move away from secular scripts on a number of things, including Darwinism, which you bring up in your book. You're trying to not only talk about what's happening in secular culture, but you're warning against how the church, how Christians are absorbing that secular script and sort of setting aside the biblical script. Do I have that right?
Well, it's interesting because the research on Christian men splits into two very different groups.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of surprising. This was one of the things that a lot of people say they never knew before they read my book. And of course, I'm not, it's not my own research. I'm reporting on research. What happened is, of course, Christian men are often accused of being exhibit A of toxic masculinity.
Right.
The idea is that if you believe in any notion of male headship in the home, that will turn the man into an overbearing, tyrannical, oppressive patriarch.
Mm.
Well, that's an empirical claim. And so I looked for empirical evidence. And the sociologists and psychologists were listening to these charges and saying, where is your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And in my book, I quote some dozen or more studies on evangelical men. And what they found out is that if evangelical men are very committed and attend church regularly, then they actually test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers of any group in America. So this is incredibly encouraging.
I hope you're enjoying this episode of Dare to Think. We'll get back to it in a moment. Kerry Baldwin is an independent researcher with a degree in philosophy. Her mission is to reignite curiosity and thoughtful reflection by challenging and rethinking paradigms in politics, religion, and culture. She does this by producing content developed out of her work as an independent researcher. Her current project is formalizing her proposal for a libertarian theory of reproductive rights. She seeks to reconcile human rights between women and their offspring. She also teaches online courses in critical thinking. Please subscribe to this podcast, Dare to Think, on your favorite podcatcher, and also go rate and review Dare to Think on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or Amazon. This will help others find Kerry's podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on Kerry's latest articles and episodes, please subscribe to her monthly email list at mereliberty.com/signup. To learn more about her course, visit libertyseminar.com. Now, let's get back to the episode.
I mentioned Brad Wilcox earlier. He did the largest study on this. And to give you some sense of his stature, he gets published in places like the New York Times.
Wow.
So let me give you exactly, not very common for Christians. And I'll give you a quote. Sometimes, direct wording can really drive it home. In an article in the New York Times, he says, "It turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages." And then my favorite part of the quote actually is that he then turns to his secular colleagues, because sociology tends to be one of the most secularized disciplines. And he says, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and evangelicals in particular. Evangelical Protestant men who attend church regularly test out consistently as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. So the research on the one hand is showing us Christian men test out at the top and Christian marriages test out as the happiest. And this is something most people don't know.
Right.
And by the way, they didn't just test the men, they tested the wives.
Mm-hmm.
And so the wives report the highest levels of happiness with the way their husbands treat them. The evangelical couples spend the most time with their children, 3.5 hours more per week than secular men. They are the least likely to divorce, 35% less likely to divorce than secular couples. And they have the lowest rate of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America. So the good news is something that we really should be getting out into the churches,
right?
To encourage Christian men we need to make sure that we're giving them the good news. I have another graduate student who was the head of ministry for a very large, the women's ministry in a very large Baptist church. And she said, on Mother's Day, we hand out flowers and tell mothers they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better. And so I think it's time to stop scolding, bring this data into the churches so that we can encourage Christian men.
Right.
But then you mentioned that there are men who are absorbing the secular script.
Right.
And what happened is the pushback I always got is, but haven't we all heard that Christian couples divorce at the same rate as the surrounding culture? And so this also sent researchers back to the data, and they separated out the truly committed Christian men who attend church regularly from merely nominal Christian men. And by the way, my students don't really know what nominal means, so I have to tell them. NOM is Latin for name, so it means in name only.
Right.
And so these are men who, on a survey like this, might check the Baptist box, for example, but they do not actually attend church, rarely, if at all. And they test out shockingly different. They fit all of the toxic stereotypes.
Right.
So their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They spend the least amount of time with their kids. They have the highest rate of divorce, 20% higher than secular couples.
Jeez.
And they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular men. So this is what we're up against in trying to figure out how to address men in the church. Churches have to, on the one hand, help support and be positive towards the men who are doing a good job. And then they really need to think through, how do we disciple these men who are sort of at the fringes, who are nominal, but who are out there claiming an evangelical identity. And so in many ways, there are a lot of people who run into nominals and conclude that Christian men, are toxic and overbearing and patriarchs and so on. It's because they've run into these nominal Christian men.
Right.
And by the way, it is about this. This was one thing that surprised me. It's about the same number. I found only one study that actually gave the numbers. And because you and I probably hang out mostly with fairly committed Christian men.
Yeah.
And so I thought nominals would be a small group. No, it's about the same percent of the population.
Wow.
So that means people have a 50-50 chance that if they encounter someone who claims to be evangelical,
right,
that they'll be nominal.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a young woman, it was a female podcast host recently, and I said, the church needs to be telling young women this in particular.
Yeah.
That just because you go out with a guy who claims to be Christian, it's a 50-50 chance that he's actually a nominal.
Right.
And he's not really living it out.
Yeah, well, I was married to one of those nominal Christians and ended up going through a really nasty divorce. So actually, when one of the first things that I saw, actually, when you started promoting the book were these statistics on nominal versus devout Christian men. And it was mind-blowing for me, because my experience has been that the assumption in Christian evangelical circles is that the bad apples, so to speak, are very small, they're an exception to the rule and that sort of thing. And so the fact that there's a 50-50 chance of you running into a nominal versus devout, I think is fairly staggering. I want to ask you about, I'm going to switch gears and ask you a little bit more about the fatherless boy situation. I know that this often gets blamed on second wave feminism and specifically no-fault divorce and things like that. But one of the things that you brought out in your book was that actually goes back to industrialization. Can you speak more on that?
Yes, well, I'm glad you brought that up, because you're right. It's something that most of us don't know. We do know that fathers are mocked and ridiculed and made fun of in the media today.
Right.
From ads to Homer Simpson to the Berenstain Bears. Did your kids read the Berenstain Bears?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a son who just loved them. But the father's always the bumbling idiot. And there's the mother's smarter, and even the kids are smarter. But where did this come from? You were right, all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, because before that, men worked side by side with their wives and children all day. Right? They had a family farm or a family industry or a family business, and especially sons, because sons were pretty much apprentices alongside their fathers in the craft or the trade. And so it's hard for us to imagine, but historians tell us that fathers actually spent just as much time with their kids as mothers did. In fact, here's an interesting fact. Most literature addressed to parents back then, books, articles, sermons, were addressed to fathers, not to mothers. If you go in a typical bookstore today, it'll be mostly mothers.
Right.
But fathers were considered the primary parent. And they, in fact, did spend, well, like I said, they spent as much time as mothers. So they were very involved fathers. How did we lose that? At the Industrial Revolution, well, what it did is took work out of the home. And so men had to follow their work out of the home into factories and offices. And for the first time, men were not working with their family members. And I had a chance to read for my, in writing the book, I read a lot of literature on that time. Already in the 19th century, people were shocked at what was happening to the family because the father wasn't there all day. We're so used to it now.
Right.
But at the time, it was experienced as shocking. So, for example, I'll give you a specific example. 1842, Parents Magazine had an article in which they said the greatest source of domestic sorrow now is paternal neglect.
Wow.
And they said the father is pursuing his business early and late and is no longer fulfilling his duties to his children. Or Frances Willard, who started or was the president, at least, of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, wrote that father absence was the major problem facing the family. I mean, people say that today. We don't realize, no, they were already saying that in the 19th century. And so she wrote, the father is the prototype of the divine, because God is our father.
Right.
And yet this prototype of God is absent from his family from Sunday to Sunday. He's really just there on the weekends. And they were, even many of the laws passed back then that we think were for religious reasons were actually to get fathers back in the home. So, of course, the temperance unit, all the activism in favor of temperance was to get fathers out of the taverns and back to the family hearth.
Right.
And get them to stop spending so much money on alcohol, spending the family money, and even things like blue laws, right? Closing of stores on Sunday. That was to give fathers a day off.
Wow.
So they could spend more time with their family.
Wow.
And so all of this to say that we've been dealing with father absence for a very long time. And it does also suggest, what the solution is. Is there a way that even in an industrial era, we can reconnect fathers better to their kids? Can we flex the workplace at all? The pandemic actually was a game changer because a lot of men discovered they actually liked being with their kids. Harvard University did a study. It's not in the book because it just came out. Harvard did a study in which 68% of fathers said during the pandemic, they got closer to their children and they don't want to lose that.
Wow. And
I thought, wonderful. Fathers actually like being more involved with their kids.
Right.
And another study, which is in the book, 70% of fathers said they would take a pay cut if that's what it took to have more flexible hours and more time with their family.
Wow. And
they're willing to pay the daddy penalty, as it's sometimes called. They know they won't advance maybe quite as quickly. They won't, go up the career ladders quite as quickly. But when asked in surveys, they say they'd pay the daddy penalty if that allowed them more time with their family.
Wow. Now there's a lot of focus on that topic in terms of fatherless boys, but did you find any impact on fatherless daughters as a consequence?
So let's start with fatherless boys. This used to be a conservative issue. Unfortunately, it is no longer. people on both sides of the aisle now recognize that fatherless boys have more social pathologies. Right? They have trouble in school. They drop out of school. They have more drug and alcohol addiction. They're more likely to have kids outside of marriage. They're more likely to commit crime. Fatherlessness has a greater impact than poverty or race or education.
Wow.
I used to work for Prison Fellowship, which is a international prison ministry. So we know this firsthand, that the vast majority of men sitting behind bars, especially for violent crimes, were, well, I don't remember the exact numbers anymore, but something like 80% were from fatherless homes.
Wow.
So it is a big issue, and that gives us more motivation for saying, what can we do about this? And by the way, one thing I found encouraging in my research was father substitutes can have a big impact. Because I do get asked that sometimes. Well, what about fatherless boys? If you're talking about fathers should be home more, flex the workplace. Father substitutes can have a big impact. Grandparents, most of all, but also other extended family and coaches. Coaches have a big impact on young men. Teachers, church youth group workers, Big Brother programs.
Right.
They have found that it actually does have a big impact. So that means it's something all of us can participate in solving.
Yeah.
So that's encouraging. I did not look that much into girls just because it's a book on boys.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
And from the 19th century, girls at least had their mother in the home. And so they suffered from not having their father, but at least they had a role model of what it meant to be a woman.
Right. Yeah.
Whereas boys did not have a day-to-day model anymore of what it meant to be a man.
Right.
The father was invisible all day. And Robert Bly, I don't know if you know, the contemporary men's movement was founded by Robert Bly. And he says the main love bond damaged by the Industrial Revolution was the father-son bond.
Wow.
And so he calls it industrial fatherlessness, which I love.
Yeah.
Because technically fathers were still in the home, but they were gone all day. So they really were getting out of touch. In fact, this is the source of all those contemporary images mocking fathers. Already in the 19th century, you see people saying, fathers are gone all day, so they're out of touch. They no longer know what their kids are thinking and what their kids are experiencing. And so they began to be described as irrelevant, superfluous, and incompetent. Already back in the 19th century, because they simply weren't there enough.
That's really amazing. I mean, and for me, it makes so many things click in my head. I mean, I've got two boys and I have one girl. And thankfully their grandparents were involved after my nasty divorce. And my dad had the biggest impact on my sons for sure. So thank God for that. But, for so long I had that narrative that the sort of 1950s stereotype housewife, mom stays home with the kids and dad goes out and works. And that's the biblical ideal. Never quite made sense to me. And so your research really blew that out of the water for me. I thought, oh, this makes much more sense. We're going back further than, just this idealized, Norman Rockwell painting sort of thing. So at any rate, I want to be respectful of your time. I'm so grateful that you came on to chat with me about your book. I highly, highly recommend it to my audience. It is called The Toxic War on Masculinity. You can find it on Amazon. Nancy, did you want to say anything else in closing?
Well, not on only Amazon, but I would invite people to come to my website. My publisher very graciously updated it, so it's colorful and fun now. Okay. So you can browse my other books too. And you can leave a message. I read them. I don't always have time to answer them, but I really enjoy hearing from people. But yeah, it's fun now, which it never was before. So come on over, nancypearcey.com. So come on over and say hello.
Wonderful. I will make sure to put all of those links in the show notes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Dare to Think. This is the official podcast of mereliberty.com. There you can explore other episodes, interviews, and articles which seek to challenge and rethink prevailing paradigms. If you liked today's episode and would like to get access to premium content, please consider becoming a monthly member. For as little as $5 a month, you can support the production of this podcast, and for $27 a month, you can get access to premium content. You can find that information at mereliberty.com and click on monthly memberships to learn more. Don't forget to check out Kerry's courses in critical thinking at libertyseminar.com. Kerry uses the Socratic method to teach students ages 14 and older to reflect on their own thinking as a primary means of learning rather than mere debate. The course is great for teens, parents, or any adult seeking to improve these skills. Visit libertyseminar.com for details, and please do leave a review of Dare to Think on Apple and YouTube, and follow Kerry on Facebook and Twitter.